Hi, welcome back again. I've noticed in my previous few videos that I've been trying to delineate my topics too concretely, and I think it's making them feel more like lectures than I'd prefer. I don't necessarily regret presenting them that way, because if I have a conclusive point to arrive at, then it's important that I present things with that overarching position in mind, but I'll be breaking that routine in this video for the sake of simply speaking on a subject with less of an agenda than I've had recently. Looking retrospectively on the topics I've done videos about so far, I think that the more I've scrutinized the topic, the more of a central argument I end up feeling compelled to make about it, which I suppose actually indicates that this is the topic I've given the least amount of thought to thus far, which is funny, but if you think I typically sound too pseudo-intellectual and preachy, then maybe you'll enjoy something I'm not try-harding to get across. Like I touched upon last video, there's been a huge downturn in collective CT community motivation to play this game in the wake of MK World. It's always been during these dead periods that I find myself thinking about the history of the game in broader terms. I imagine this inclination is born out of some kind of melancholic rest in peace MKW notion that I've always been prone to. And if you've watched this series, you could have probably gleaned I'm quite sentimental and nostalgic like that. This time around, I was looking through my comprehensive notepad document with all of my ideas and stumbled upon some notes I took from a great conversation I had late last year when I brought up doing a video on this idea. I never go out of my way to bring up my channel in conversation because this is all more so a personal project for me, and I understand most people have no interest in this, ultimately meaning I don't really end up running my ideas by other people. This time was an exception, though. The conversation was with a few PL2 people, and the subject I brought up had to do with the sort of obsolete nomenclature that's used to describe different generations of players on CTs. The first instance of these sociological generation divides is obviously with the boomer versus zoomer distinction that you may think cropped up following the toilet duck merge, since you would expect that people would be prompted to think in a retrospective, self-conscious way when considering what relational categories they may or may not fall into as players in the wake of such a groundbreaking upheaval of the social structure of the community. And while I believe that process did occur, it doesn't reflect the kind of community that would be inclined to engage with this subject in the first place. Boomers versus Zoomers wouldn't have been unofficially codified into the community lexicon if a precursor to the concept hadn't already been boiling within the primordial soup that was toilet duck. Despite the fact that Toilet Duck, which refers to the old CT lounge for those unaware, was a small server and existed for a relatively short time period across the span of the aggregate history of competitive CTs, the same trends that occur on a wider scale within MKW and within gaming still took place in the server. Wherever a group of people may gather, it is a fact of human nature that hierarchies will begin to naturally arise in an entropic sense. Regardless of whether efforts are made to represent each member of that group as equals, there will invariably be those who come to be known as higher or lower than their peers. However, there's no need for any kind of Rawlsian thought experiment here. I only mean to prime this topic. Of course, the actual mechanism for dividing people into groups is expedited primarily by a matchmaking system as far as any lounge-esque environment goes. In-game is a different story for games like MKW, where there isn't a deliberate mechanic used for the sake of pseudo-hierarchy creation, like in something like Call of Duty, where a gold weapon skin can indicate that you're the designated pub stomper of the lobby. Likewise for CSGO, where matchmaking ratings and skins both function as a means to show your superiority. I've already spoken at length about how MKW forgoes many of the tropes of other games, mainly modern games, and the congruence of each player's observable in-game experience also drives this home in a way that seems to beg for the player-made hierarchies that we see so commonly. Short of using textures, just about everyone is going to be playing Funky Kong on 16:9 aspect ratio and attempting to mimic racing lines from the same BKT video that everybody else in the room has watched. Zilla even made it a game to try to determine who was playing a given race from nothing more than gameplay style, which I of course then tried to metagame by looking at the recording quality and which controller someone's lines seemed to indicate they were playing on. The point is that comparing players to each other in online races is entirely a community-centric social construct once you reach Quad 9s, thereby inviting some kind of universal factor to prove your experience and worth as a player that precedes any other factors. As far as I've observed, this constant factor seems to be veteranship. If you've been playing longer, you have the right to be elitist, especially on the CT side where there's such a storied history. And this elitism is further expedited by the tier system in a symbiotic relationship, because veteran players have had the chance to accumulate MMR over time and aren't going to be anywhere near the low-tier new players. New players are expected to climb for a while and accumulate experience and cultural awareness in just about every serious competitive game. Let's say in League of Legends, for example, the low rank through high rank experiences take place in entirely different strata of the global community. In Lounge, and especially on CTs which have only ever maintained at most a 3-tier system, the community is operating and interacting within quite close metaphorical quarters. Being in the same Discord server as Faker would be an achievement in itself, but you could go and tag Brody and Zilla right now if you'd like. The tighter-knit nature of MKW thereby necessitates a more stringent idea of individual stratification. It's out of a desire to do this that the high-tier CT community itself self-determines its own elitist structures. Back to Toilet Duck, then. With such an inherently limiting population at hand, we can observe most accurately how CT players, whose externally sourced reasons for being elitist was the focus of the entire preceding segment, will attempt to institute this elitism. The player base of Toilet Duck, which featured a dedicated core of active players as well as a peripheral pool of slightly less active server members, entailed a system I'll call the 1.5 tier system for short. There did exist tiers for the 2 standard and premium roles, but they were both much less active than the principal all-div tier. Even though they would often go weeks at a time without gathering, they each addressed their own unique concern of the server as a whole. The standard tiers is less interesting. It built a small sense of community amongst all of the hard-stuck starting ELO players like myself at the time. The rooms felt a lot like fun CT Worldwides. The premium tier, on the other hand, was instrumental in giving the high-tier players a sense of identity and a place they could aspire to foster a thriving sub-community within. A domino effect starting with something as simple as FL players trying to forego the randoms that would occasionally can up in all-div could result in an entire evening's worth of back-to-back events at the highest level of competitive CTs. I remember often watching these events and feeling fascinated by how the all-div meta was entirely flipped on its head. Without such a skill gap, the rooms evolved into the kind of elevated sense of competitiveness that you'd see in top RT rooms, and what I saw motivated me to want to join them myself. Unfortunately, I never would until after the merge, but it's exactly this category of thought that engenders a generational consciousness. Players, particularly at the top of their sub-community, create and defend the notion of their own in-group via things like segregated tiers, toxicity towards the out-group, reoccurring tracks. All of these motifs can be used to categorize players in a game that doesn't inherently lend itself to that sense of generational development. This is how it takes place. Veteranship begets elitism, which begets structuralized elitism, which begets generational consciousness. That's the SparkNotes version. And then, of course, people who want to distinguish themselves from other groups in the community will then presumably define these generations. So, back to Boomers vs. Zoomers. Now, Boomers vs. Zoomers, which was the name of a tournament hosted in late 2020 by Mike and Pascal, for those unaware, was an actualization of the epiphany that some of those elitist Toilet Duck premium package players came to following the merge with Vito Lounge. That realization being that there existed players who had never been a part of their clique that could potentially match them skill-wise. If this was true, of course, it could have invalidated the prospects of any future superiority complex amongst the boomers, but looking back, the concept was slightly underwhelming so far as specifically distinguishing generations goes. A few of the players on each team were interchangeable, and the criterion that determined what generation a player ostensibly belonged to was based on when that person started playing CTs, thereby incorporating a few equally as tenured players of MKW itself, but who just so happened to have less track knowledge like Frozen. But given that the nomenclature had already been established beforehand as a kind of half-joke, this one-off, unofficial invitational had the byproduct of defining the lines along which we'd perceive the CT player base going forwards. Despite the fact that it involved nothing more than a cursory effort at sociology via joke-turned-reality by splitting the community down the middle, it brought a focus on the real generational gap that existed and gave a sense of legitimacy to the potential development of high-tier CTs in the wake of Toilet Duck's elitist framework being removed from the equation. In terms of the organization of the tourney and the races themselves, it was all excellently handled. If you've made it this far into one of my videos, you're also likely the kind of person who would enjoy watching Emil's perspective of the tourney. However, there was an unforeseen consequence of such a binary distinction between generations. It's not a fault of the dichotomy itself per se, since the CT community was less developed and had existed for a much proportionally shorter time, but the fact that it remained the only comprehensive motif when it came to player generations years after the conception of the idea has created a problem with trying to sequence any further generations. I was having a hard time trying to explain this eloquently, so I'll just outline my entire thought process here. As I already specified, the Boomers vs. Zoomers meme was just that, a meme inspired by real-world sociological generations. I can see where the rationale for this comes from beyond mere old versus new. The elitism of the old guard is analogous to disengaged real-life boomers, and the new players looking to prove themselves, like Thunder, who certainly wouldn't describe any special significance to veterans just because they've been around, represent the determined Gen Z go-getter crowd. Where I identify the problem is in the possibility of ever repeating the straightforward success that this categorization saw. You see, I haven't seen anyone brave enough to attempt to coin any new terminology to describe the waves of players and tracks on a CT community-wide scale ever since CTL began. Perhaps you could classify the past 5 years as the CTL era, but that would be such an oversimplification of everything from within that time period. A comparable amount of time has elapsed from the beginning of CTL to right now as it had from when CTWL first began to when MKPS took over. And there are so many discernible echelons within that time frame, regardless of how wide of a scope you'd like to examine it from. On the macro level, you can trace the development and origins of clans like SOP, MEC, FL, BC, or at the granular level, like with BA's struggles to win playoffs and all of the short-lived niche tags like Chrome's Hideout and Living. The point is trying to transpose the storied history and all of the nuances of the CTWL through MKPS era into just one overarching term for a similar time frame would be to lose all of the intricacies that surely do exist, although I'll be honest when I say I can't point to any of those in particular outside of the top 2 divisions as far as CTL goes. Everyone is, of course, going to trace their own progression in the game and have their own terminology and individual interpretations of eras as they've personally experienced them, but I believe the reason why seemingly no one has been able to successfully articulate the player generations of the past 5 years at the same general scope as before is because nobody has recognized that the terminology that, now that every previous framework has been obsoleted, would ideally define player generations, would have to be a departure from the same conventions that you may believe would be necessary in addressing this issue. One of the reasons why this problem with diagnosis is hard to diagnose in itself is because it's both deeply ingrained and multifaceted. Fair warning that this tangent will barely address anything Mario Kart related, lampshading the schizo jokes here as well, etc. With that being said, this definition challenge's difficulty arises at both the cognitive level as well as the etymological level. The first aspect of this is that mental gravitation to concepts you're familiar with, the inherent assignment of a disproportionate amount of significance to them. I'm sure you don't need me to didactically explain the availability heuristic because you definitely already know this just on an instinctual level, but I still need to introduce it because it explains why each person's individual definition of an MKW timeline doesn't catch on outside of their own friend groups. I could sit here and try to reconcile the AB to BC to RN development cycle within the context of the wider history of CETs, but it would mean nothing to you because its value is sentimental, to me that is, and not objective. Even with reference to the most culturally influential clans of a given time period, ICB being the poster child for this phenomenon since around late 2023, trying to define a history around them, i.e. the ICB era, will still leave the majority of players completely contextless. That is to say, there's nothing to designate them with that frame of reference in mind, even if you're only talking about high tier / high div. Something more panoramic would be necessary if you wanted to accurately categorize teams and players for the sake of comparing and contrasting them across distinct time periods. And so one may be immediately tempted to gravitate towards the same kind of transposed real-world terminology I've been talking about that exists antithetical to MKW-sourced expressions for the sake of seeming more legitimate. However, there's yet another roadblock to this that has to do with the origins of the wording itself used for something like boomers versus zoomers. The generation to come after the zoomers, whatever set of years that may encompass, like 2021 to 2023 join daters if you find that time frame acceptable, could perhaps be given the same moniker that the generation to follow Gen Z was in real-world sociology, that being Gen Alpha, but then you're immediately inclined to think of the real Gen Alpha. Now, unless you're Nate, then that is obviously a misnomer, but more importantly, it fails to capture the spirit of that simple dualism from back then, which was simply a convenient way of pitting old versus new against each other by imitating a well-known meme from contemporary culture. This will be a completely gratuitous tangent into IRL sociology, but even the term Zoomer or Gen Z itself barely even managed to survive its own birth range time period before the concept of dividing generations along such comparatively long-term lines proved that it would be a hopelessly outmoded framework. What I mean by comparatively is that the universal prevalence of the internet has engendered an all-permeating culture of micro-generations. No further evidence for this is needed than juxtaposing the TikTok memes from 2 back-to-back years and wondering how they could have possibly all had their 72-hour hype cycles within a chronological vicinity of each other that would have been unfathomable as recently as last decade. As a result, the idea of generations just collapses immediately. MKW terminology may as well be used to describe the real world at this point because sociology obviously can't. Normally this would be the part where I try to reconcile the point of the tangent to the video topic, but it's actually much of the opposite. Of course, player generations are still short-term themselves, and I'd hazard a guess that people would agree that they'd only comprise a few years at most if they were to be formally specified at all, but you don't get either the homogeneous mass media pop culture funnel or the hyper-individualized and insulated experience, both of which are well-founded interpretations of the 2020s internet when it comes to MKW. Community development is more similar to the early internet in that sense for reasons I've repeated like a broken record in previous videos, such as the game's physics being set in stone, MKW players not being the kind of people to belong to the restless contemporary zeitgeist, etc. It's certainly encouraging that community development can still be charted along the same lines as it always has been, but I suppose the twist here is that I can comment upon all of this while still lacking any propositions. I don't have any genius linguistic solution myself, and all I can really do is hope that players from periods like mine will earn a decent moniker eventually, because, as I recall Thunder once saying, clans like RN are the middle children of CTs who can slot in alongside contemporary turn-of-the-decade clans like AC, but still don't fit into any established frameworks on a grander scale, which will remain an obstacle to building a proper chronology unless these lost generations get a name at some point. When I initially got this idea, I had no way of judging whether or not this obscure and comparatively uninteresting topic was just a product of my imagination or not. After all, if nobody over the span of multiple years in the CG community has thought to give a name to any previous or concurrent eras of players, then it most likely would also not be an area that would be seriously addressed if you were to examine similar gaming communities and transpose the concept there. This is practically going to be MKW versus Other Games episode 2.5 from here on out because it's easiest to present the idea like this. Although it is true that I don't find this to be a reoccurring issue in any other communities, like with Geometry Dash for instance, where there's never seemed to be any issue categorizing different time periods, even during the 7 years during which the game wasn't receiving updates. Community fan historians, who do exist in GD, simply do just what I would do, wherein they interpret which time periods had certain overarching attitudes, prominent levels, quintessential players, and then partition time periods based upon those factors, with eras typically being defined by the top players at a given time. But one community where I did notice the same kind of unscalable period-specific jargon was in Melee, which took the top player worship to the next level in the early 2010s by quite literally defining a set of players as the 5 gods, who were of course the 5 best players in the world. It served its purpose as a community rallying point incredibly well and was a central theme of the Smash Bros. Documentary from 2013 where I first learned of the game, which made learning about the history of top-level play feel like an epic ongoing story. But now that most of them have retired from the game, I'm not sure if there's any framework to meaningfully replace it, nor does anyone care to try to reproduce or otherwise artificially elongate that period. The current rank 1 player isn't collectively referred to as the supreme god or anything like that. However, when I was researching Melee's eras for this video, I noticed a somewhat similar trend as has taken place in MKW. In Melee, following the release of the documentary about the 5 gods that I just mentioned, the video went viral on YouTube and inspired thousands of people to try their own hand at the game, who then proceeded to get good at a rate that allowed them to outpace the veterans fast enough to be able to defeat them in a few years' time. When the communities for games in which this phenomenon takes place try to come to terms with what they're experiencing and make sense of how their favorite players could now be on merely equal footing with new gens who have far less established presence, the presumptive answer tends to have to do with new players having had access to superior resources than veterans did when they first learned the game. And as incomplete as I personally believe that explanation is, it is more than adequate in terms of how it opens the door to truly elucidating how new players can gain skill at such an accelerated rate. In Geometry Dash, it is an inescapable process to watch as all of the hardest levels in the game gradually become antiquated as newer and even more difficult levels take their place. The hardest level of 2021 was beaten 3 times in a row last year, and it was done by someone who started playing the game seriously in 2022. Young new players have become such a threat in GD that people have even begun to convince themselves that age is the ultimate disadvantage and that the neuroplasticity and reaction speed you need to play at a top level nowadays completely evaporates once you approach the cusp of adulthood. However, I propose a different theory that has to do with collective mindset and the Overton window of difficulty as well as skill. This is not my entirely original idea, but I'd had inklings of this before I ever heard of it in GD. For the sake of this, you can imagine that the sum total of the competitive GD community at a given time is like a snapshot on a virtual machine. If you start playing the game at a certain time, you'll both consciously and subconsciously absorb every facet of the community's beliefs, achievements, and mannerisms as they exist at that point in time. But because the community is always moving forwards while undergoing continual periods of transformation and retrospective reappraisal, an entirely different idea as to what is realistically achievable in GD can have developed a few years after you initially pick up the game. One of the most difficult mental challenges you would thereby face as a prospective top player would be to learn how and when to update your own mental schema and realize where you're subconsciously being held back by old ideas. The crucial problem, though, is that it may not even be entirely possible to shed the unconscious bias that you have towards that outmoded framework. It's an extremely common theme for longtime players to feel completely overwhelmed by the pace at which the former hardest levels that they know and love are displaced, and they continue to hold on to the notion that the limit of their personal ability lies in that range of difficulty. And it's because that static snapshot of the game as it formerly existed is still preeminent in their minds. The reason I've taken so long unpacking GD here is simply because this concept is most tangibly observable in that game, but this is by no means exclusive to just that, and I've even heard it mentioned with regards to MKW. Most notably, I recall Fox invoking a very similar idea once when discussing why the gameplay standard of the 2016 World Cup was so poor compared to just a few years later. Over the course of my time playing MKW, I've seen an innovative concept go from an unorthodox playstyle to a foundational principle, the impact of which raised the community's skill floor and spawned a generation capable of improving at an exponential rate, that being niche. I was initially going to make this its own video, but I've come to the conclusion that it isn't a long enough topic, and it slots in better here considering that I want to make this feel more thorough. 2.5 years ago, Thunder joined Call one day and told us that he had just written a paper about how niche has changed competitive MKW. I was surprised to hear that he had gone to the effort of putting his thoughts into a paper. Everything in it was a culmination of a thread of thought he had expressed over the years, but we were more so surprised at the formality of it. When asked why he would do this, Thunder simply responded that he was bored. Rereading it in the context of this video, I've recognized that he was approaching an awareness of how the community's process of grappling with the widespread adoption of niche has practically created multiple different generations, each with a progressively increased comprehension of item play. However, what he actually wrote about in the paper was just the starting point for this. Ever since the first high-tier RD players began to imitate the kind of play seen in Leop's niche montages, Thunder had always had grievances with players who were flimsily flashy and over-aggressive, especially considering how incompatible with that kind of gameplay Thunder has historically been as a player. He's always focused on being optimal and making the right plays at the right time. He contrasted these Leops wannabes with his own gameplay by framing them as people who play for montage clips and himself as someone who plays in a way you'd see fit to upload selected races videos of. I really have to praise how efficient it is to express the idea like this. It's very economical, just like how Thunder tries to be in-game. And just like Leops himself, many of the top players trying to implement niche into their skill set would upload montages showing their progression as players with regards to all of the clips they had hit, and this soon turned into a self-fulfilling prophecy. People would continue to upload niche montages and get inspiration for new kinds of plays in a cycle, but as Thunder pointed out, this would begin to leave a noticeable gap in the community. There are already not very many deliberately created resources for new players to learn from, and so the overabundance of niche videos quickly became one of the only ways of keeping current with what RT players were doing. And just as how old players in other games with expanding metas need to reorient themselves to keep up, the long-term impact of the niche epidemic has created 3 different categories of players with reference to how far along in their career they were when this process first began in mid to late 2020. The first belongs to those in the same boat as me, who had already solidified their skill set before then, and, if they did incorporate niche into their skill set, only did so after they had already improved to around their skill ceiling by that point in time. Then the second category is of players who were first developing their skill set right around the same time all this was occurring, that being 2020 to around 2022. Finally, the third category belongs to those who only started playing the game seriously / competitively after niche had already been cemented as a legitimate playstyle. I'd say the poster child for that middle group is Soon. Ever since Soon broke into high tier, I watched him improve hand in hand with the CT community's implementation of flashier and more difficult strats and mechanics, and his development as a player came off as perplexingly backwards to an old player like myself. Soon would take a relentless approach to mastering over-the-top cuts like Tropical Factory Shroomless and New Moon Manor Task Cut, alongside an exhaustive knowledge of just about every other strat there was to know. I can never wrap my head around why he was so idolized by the low-tier CT player base, but in retrospect it makes perfect sense. His streams were a place not just to learn, but to watch someone who had a sense of fascination towards getting good just like they did. Whereas I prioritized learning to drive each track at a solid level before I ever tried to incorporate any outlandish cuts like the Ag on Yoshi Lagoon. Soon did both simultaneously as he learned the game, effectively making it seem as though he was going through the learning process backwards, and it's all a result of how the game was coming to be viewed vastly differently at the beginning of the 2020s. With someone like him in mind, the tilt towards visual ornamentation in the MKW community around that time is already quite evident, but soon was still inherently limited in a way that players who have started to play MKW after niche was already an embedded idea are not. He was an extremely passionate contributor to the process and helped immensely to bring the idea to CTs, but in the long run Soon was still ultimately only a participant during the formative period. The image of the community that he subconsciously picked up at the moment he began to play the game didn't include niche as a pre-established model. Keep in mind how critical that framework you initially absorb is. By mid to late 2022, though, the idea of niche was already firmly in everyone's minds, and it's around this time when Ton first picked up CTs. From when he first started playing the game, Ton was clearly inspired by this aggressive niche playstyle, and it's this that allowed him to become one of the fastest improving players in the entire game's history. He played his first CT event in July of 2022, and by June of 2023 he was Master. That means within less than just one singular year, Ton had already reached a level that the vast majority of players will never aspire to. Then, after another year of playing actively, he hit CTGM in July of 2024. One of the most exponential rates of improvement of any player, all while constantly innovating and developing his own green spots as well as a very efficient trapping mentality overall, with his typical modus operandi being getting up there as quickly as possible and maintaining that front presence for multiple races at a time via niche item usage. I was there on the day that Ton first hit Master, and although he wasn't quite as known then, the amount of coping over it was truly astounding. It wasn't to single him out so as to hate on him or to imply that his achievement was a fluke, but rather sheer bewilderment as to how someone who was completely non-existent 1 year ago could have surpassed 99% of the player base. A year of playtime is a conventional amount of time to gain the faintest sense of self-actualization in-game, and yet Ton had used niche to become a more complete player than all the long-standing players that he outpaced in that time period. I propose that it's precisely because Ton falls under the chronological category of post-niche era players that he was able to improve at such an insane pace. Even someone like Soon, who's as well versed in the most unorthodox strats that CTs have to offer as they come, was only ever fundamentally able to conceive of niche as a subsequently developed tool in his skill set. Even though he learned the game during niche's heyday, he was only ever capable of gaining his skill concurrently with the community. Soon may have been the one throwing greens off walls every turn, but it wasn't something he had to deal with everyone else trying to imitate themselves from day one. Because of how high the niche-related skill floor already was by the time Ton got into the game, his subsequent attainment of that discipline wasn't merely an additional skill on top of an already existing skill set, it was a guiding principle of his gameplay. And that's where the tie-in to player generations comes back into play. Players who belong to this post-niche generation like Ton does have the unique trait of having a fully integrated understanding of both how to use niche as well as how to play in a world where it's been universalized. And it's this that finally offers an explanation as to why veteran players in various communities are at the mercy of talented newcomers. Going back to consolidate that point I made before about operating on an outdated subconscious level, this is the vector by which it takes place. The skill ceiling is raised by the hard work put into gradual development by a given player base, before that work is then translated into a higher skill floor for future generations. Anyone can comment on the evolution of customary strats over time on Artes, for example, but I think that the real underlying driver of community progress is actualized through everything in between. All of the minor nuances and tech that underlies and differentiates each generation of players. An inflection point of mine came after I brought this topic up to Volumes when he asked me what I was doing for my next video. I forget if Ton was also there or not. He seemed so incredulous after being presented the idea that people played so much more passively in the past and that the consistent aggression that he and so many others have come to adopt was only a relatively recent development in the grand scheme of the game. What he said to me was, "I can't imagine a world without niche." I find that very, very interesting and even oddly inspiring. I suppose if there's any goal that a generation of players should aspire to, even if they aren't aware of knowing how they'll be posthumously categorized, it should be to create a meta that forthcoming generations can build upon without the baggage of the past. Once you've become sufficiently revolutionary, no one will even be able to fathom how it could possibly be any other way. So that's the end of the video, or at least it was going to be before the CTC server was announced. After a good deal of drama over the past few CTL seasons, the community is officially overthrowing them and creating a new league. I honestly don't have much to say about this, but I am very glad that it is happening, and all of the changes they've made seem like the competitive leap forward that I've been waiting for. Less restrictive bagging clause rules, no draggable blue shells, and the Season 1 track format is going to be divisional draft, which I'm of course most enthusiastic for, given that I did a video commending it. I'll put it in the recommended end card in the outro. In my mind, though, perhaps the most important advancement of this league has already been made. I kept everything I had to say prior to CTC's release intact for the sake of not retroactively recontextualizing those thoughts, but when I mentioned my distaste towards the idea of trying to divide CTL by early, middle, and late stage sub-eras, I was doing so without the knowledge of how long it would last for. I notated that under the assumption that CTL would last for a while longer. But now, with CTL's 14 discrete seasons in mind, the evolution of the league can now be looked at more systematically by anyone who has an interest in that kind of thing. Even if CTC turns out to be worse than if we had stuck with CTL, I still think it's better in the long run for the wheel of fate to revolve every once in a while so no one ever ends up saying insane shit like Season 20 of a league. And so my Hail Mary wish to somehow have that classification issue I mentioned resolved has come true, thereby making this all just a big waste of your time, but all of my videos are essentially just that anyways. Now that's been addressed, this is the real end of the commentary. Thank you very dearly for watching, and goodbye.